Welcome everyone to the American Eel Management Board.
You're going to have to mute yours.
One minute. Hang on. How do I do that?
Here you go.
Got it?
You're good.
Hi, my name is Marty Gary. I'm with the Potomac River Fisheries Commission, and I'll be your chair. Before we start our meeting today, I'd like to defer to our Executive Director, Bob Beal. We have a couple new folks at the Management Board table. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just want to make a couple quick introductions. Two new administrative commissioners and one new governor's appointee who used to be an administrative commissioner. From North Carolina, there's a new administrative commissioner, Steve Murphy. Steve's in the audience. I think, Steve, are you back there? There he is. There's Steve Murphy sitting behind the delegation from North Carolina. So welcome, Steve. We're glad you're here. From Georgia, Doug Hamons is the new administrative commissioner from Georgia. He's taken Spud Woodward's position. And don't let Spud's presence here fool you. He's not in his old job. He's in a new position. He's now the governor's appointee from Georgia. So he switched seats, but he came back for more. So we're glad to see all y'all here. Thank you. And that's it, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Bob. So before we start, thanks to Herring Board Chairman Pat Kelleher and Dr. Pierce for getting us back on time and giving us an extra 11 minutes. It's our last meeting of the day, and we've got a lot of ground to cover. Our first item of the day is the approval of the agenda. Does anyone have any changes to the agenda? Seeing none, is there any objection to approving the agenda as presented? Seeing none, the agenda is approved. Next item is the approval of the proceedings from the October 2017 meeting. Are there any changes to the proceedings of that meeting? Is there any objection to accepting the proceedings of the October 2017 meeting? Seeing none, those proceedings are approved. Next item is public comment. I understand nobody has signed up, but just to double check, is there anyone in the audience that would like to comment, offer public comment on items that are not on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll move on to our next item. Consideration of approval of draft addendum 5 for public comment with potential management action. We have two components to this, and so the way we'd like to proceed is a presentation from Kirby, followed by questions only, followed by a presentation by Kristen from the Stock Assessment Subcommittee with questions only, and then we'll go to board discussion. Kirby?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So Marty laid out pretty much how I'm going to go through the presentation. First, in terms of the draft addendum 5, there's a statement of the problem. I'm going to briefly outline that. The potential timetable for this document moving forward, an overview of the management options. If there are any questions after I go through that, because it will be the bulk of my presentation, I'm happy to answer it. And then, as Marty said, we'll turn it over to Kristen. She'll present the Stock Assessment Subcommittee's response on a couple of the questions that the Allocation Working Group posed, answer any questions that you all have on that, and then move to board discussion. So on the statement of the problem, the board decided to initiate management action back in October 2017, largely around two issues. On yellow eels, there was concerns raised about the current management triggers as spelled out in Addendum 4 and the potential implementation of state-by-state quotas due to the coastwide overage of the coastwide cap based on 2016 landings information. The other component is regarding the glass eel fishery. The board took action to set Maine's glass eel quota for the 2018 season. The addendum 4 laid out what the quota was for 2015 through 2017, but required that the board reconsider that quota prior to the 2018 season. So the board has already dealt with what the quota will be for this year. But moving forward, the addendum puts forward options regarding how to either maintain or increase that potential quota. At the bottom of this slide lays out that specific motion that also specifies that the addendum the board initiated would start in terms of any new management during the 2019 fishing season. So regarding the potential timeline for this draft document, the board initiated it in October. Today, the board will consider approval of draft addendum 5 for public comment. If the board decides to approve the document today for public comment would start this month and go through March, at which point public comment would end, and the board would then take final action on this document at the May 2018 board meeting. So first, I'm going to go through the glass seal specific portion of the document. And there are two sections that are dealing with glass seal management. The first is regarding Maine's glass seal quota. The second, based on the allocation working group's discussions, is the proposal to consider changes to the aquaculture allowances. Currently, Addendum 4 lays out that states may request the board's approval of aquaculture plans for domestic aquaculture purposes of harvesting up to 200 pounds for use in those aquaculture facilities. So in dealing with the first part of that section, 3.1, options for Maine's glass seal quota, it's pretty straightforward. There are just two options that are put forward in the document, starting on page 11. The first is to either maintain Maine's glass seal, option 1, at its current level of 9,688 pounds, The second option would be to increase Maine's glass seal quota back to the 2014 level of 11,479 pounds. This would be about a 19% increase in the quota from recent years, 2015 to 2017. But it's important to note that it's also a 35% decrease from what the quota was prior to 2014. In 2012, the quota level was around 21,610 pounds. Additionally, in that section, the state of Maine cites the implementation of the swipe card program as part of the reason for why an increase in the quota is warranted. The swipe card program has improved tracking of landings and reduced poaching, and that's given as justification for a potential increase in the quota level. The second section is regarding proposed changes to the aquaculture plan. The first would either maintain the status quo provisions that are laid out in Addendum 4 that allow for states, as I mentioned before, to request up to 200 pounds of glass seal harvest for domestic aquaculture purposes. The second option I'll get into now, and it allows for the pooling of harvest allowances across states and jurisdictions. So there's a number of components to this, and hopefully you can read it on the screen. But what this option lays out is that up to 3 contiguously bordered states and/or jurisdictions would be allowed to pool that 200-pound allowance up to a maximum of 600 pounds. Those 200 pounds that traditionally would be attributed to just a single state, under this option would need to be harvested from each of the individual states, unless a strong argument is made that it would be preferred that they were all pooled and harvested from a single watershed system. Additionally, because the pooling of this harvest is up to 600 pounds and below 750 pounds, which was a threshold laid out in Addendum 4 regarding the requirements that if harvest was above that, a life cycle survey needed to be implemented. Because it's below that threshold, states and jurisdictions pooling under this option would not be required to implement a new life cycle survey. An additional change that this option puts forward is that states would no longer need to demonstrate that the harvest of glass seals would only occur in watersheds that minimally contribute to the spawning stock of American eels. Those were the two sections for the glass eel proposed options. I'm going to move on to the yellow eel proposed management sections. And there are 4 issue items under section 3.3. The first is regarding the coastwide cap. There are 3 options specific to that. The second is regarding the management triggers. There are 3 options specific to that. The third is regarding allocation. There are 5 options that are put forward, including 3 with sub-options. And the last is regarding transfer provisions, and there are 2 options. Before I get into those issue items under Section 3.3, it's important for the board to know that there has been an update in the commercial landings information. So when the allocation working group had their call towards the end of November, it was pointed out that there was issues with a number of the state's landings information. Based on that feedback, staff coordinated and worked with ACCSP staff and all the states to confirm the landings data that we currently had on file, or to submit new landings information that was a correction of what we had on file, no later than the beginning of January 2018. So we now have new landings information for the yellow eel fishery that differs from what was presented to the board back in August, and also differs from what is included in the stock assessment report. The updated landings indicate that the coastwide landings in 2018 were 943,808 pounds. That is still above the coastwide cap, and it's an increase from what was previously reported by approximately 15,000 to 20,000 pounds. I've tried to include on the screen what these updated landings look like for the last 5 years. Similar to how we've presented the landings information in the document, we've excluded the states of New Hampshire, Georgia, and South Carolina due to low landings or confidentiality issues. But as you can see at the bottom of this slide, it lays out what the coastwide totals are. And as you can see for 2016, we have the new number that is, again, still above the coastwide cap. So moving on to the issue item 1, proposed management options for the coastwide cap. The first option is to maintain the cap at its current status quo level of 907,671 pounds. Option 2 would move to set the cap at the 50th percentile or the median of the 1998 to 2016 landings period, which is 943,808 pounds. Option 3 would set the coastwide cap at the mean of the 1998 to 2016 landings level. That would be 951,102 pounds. It's important to note that because we have updated landings information that we requested from the states, and again, that differs from the information that's been presented to the board over the last 6 months, it revises the average landings data that was used to set the coastwide cap in Addendum 4. So the new revised coastwide landings average from 1998 to 2010 increases from the status quo level of 907,000 up to 916,469 pounds. The second issue item is regarding the management triggers. So again, these are holdovers from Addendum 4. The status quo would maintain those 2 management triggers, the first being that if the coastwide cap is exceeded by 10% in any given year, that would constitute triggering state-by-state allocation. Option 2, or excuse me, the second management trigger was regarding if the coastwide cap is exceeded for 2 consecutive years, regardless of the poundage, that would trigger state-by-state allocations. For option 1, 2, and 3, before I even get to those 2, it's important to note that there is an interaction that would take place between what is specified by this board in issue item 1 and the subsequent management triggers that would come from that. So if the coastwide cap is set at a different level based on the options in this document, it's important to note that that could change what those management triggers are in terms of a 10% overage for 1 year. So again, getting back to the options for issue 2, option 2 under issue item 2 is a one-year trigger. So that would just be, instead of having two components, it would just be if the coastwide cap is exceeded by 10% in a given year, that would trigger state-by-state allocation. Option 3 would increase it to 2 years of exceeding the cap by 10%. So as I was trying to point out, that the interaction between issue 1 and issue 2 is that if the coastwide cap is set at a potentially higher level, either option 2 or 3 under issue item 1, the management trigger could rise to 1.04 million pounds, which would be about a 4.7% increase from our current status quo management trigger. The third issue item is regarding allocation, and there's 5 options under this. The first one would be status quo state-by-state quotas. Those are laid out in Addendum 4. We've also included them in this document for reference. Option 2 is no state-by-state quotas with 2 subcomponents, or excuse me, 2 sub-options under it. Option 3 puts forward modified Addendum 4 quotas. Option 4 lays out 2 sub-options that are based on time series average of yellow eel landings over 2 different time periods. And option 5 is an allocation scheme that's based on a weighted time series average of yellow eel landings over 2 time periods. So moving on to issue item 3, option 2, where there would be no state-by-state quota, the sub-option 2A puts forward the idea of an equitable reduction, where states would collectively develop measures to achieve the needed reduction if the coastwide cap is exceeded and the management trigger is in turn also exceeded. It's important to note that as the document lays out for that option, there isn't a specific process for how that equitable reduction would be determined. It just lays out that collectively the states would develop measures to achieve the needed reduction. Option 2B moves forward with a 1% rule where only those states that are harvesting above 1% of the coastwide landings would be responsible for the reduction. Those states in the above the 1% rule would collectively work to develop measures to achieve that needed reduction, but again, it does not specify how that process would play out. Option 3 puts forward modified Addendum 4 quotas. So I'm going to try to lay out as simply as possible, and again, these start on page 17, how these adjusted quotas were calculated. So states are assigned quota that did not exceed their states assigned quota not exceeding their 2012 to 2016 average landings by more than 25%. The previous 2,000-pound minimum quota that was established for New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, South Carolina, and Georgia would be redistributed to the remaining states. All of those previous states would have their previous quota reduced to 1,000 pounds. Maine's quota would be set at the 2012 to 2016 average landings level of 5,952 pounds. With these changes, the remaining quota above would be added to the state quotas of New York, Maryland, and Virginia, with an additional amount added to Maryland's quota that's directly tied to those states that previously had a 2,000-pound minimum quota. So here on this slide, it lays out, and on page 20 in the document, it has the table for where you can find what the average landings were for those states from 2012 to 2016, what their Addendum 4 allocation is, how their average harvest compares to that Addendum 4 quota, what the Addendum 5 option 3 quota is relative to Addendum 4 quota, and then also how that new quota compares to their previously specified quota. Next, we have option 4 that lays out the simple average of time series of yellow eel landings. The first one puts forward average landings over the most recent 10-year period, so 2007 to 2016. That's option 4A. Option 4B is average landings over the most recent 5-year time series, 2012 to 2016. So on this slide here we have the first one, the average landings over 10 years. As you can see, it lays out what the addendum 4 allocation is in a percentage, what the addendum 4 allocation was in pounds, what the new percentage allocation would be under this option, and in turn what the new quota would be under this option for the state. This is for 4A, the 10-year averaged yellow eel landings. Option 4B is for a 5-year average landings amount. Similar to the previous one, it lays out how percentage allocation and the quota would change under this option relative to what's in place under Addendum 4. Option 5 is a weighted time series average of yellow eel landings over those 2 time periods. So sub-option 5A takes 50% and is weighted 50% towards the full time series average of 1998 to 2016 and 50% of the recent 10-year average, 2007 to 2016. Option 5B lays out what the weighted averages of the full-time series, 1998 to 2016, and 50% of the most recent 5 years, 2012 to 2016. These options are laid out on page 24. It's important to note that I've also included the math for how these weighted averages were calculated in Appendix 2. So similar to options 4A and B, these slides lay out what the percentage allocation is for each of the states under Addendum 4, and then how they change under these options in Addendum 5. This is for weighted time series 50%, or full time series 50%, and 50% weighted towards the recent 10 years. 5B, 50% to the full time series and 50% to the most recent 5 years. The last issue item under the addendum is regarding the transfer provisions. There are 2 options. The first would maintain the current transfer provisions that are laid out in Addendum 4, so there's no transfers that are allowed after December 31st. Option 2 provides the option to extend transfers through April 1st of the following fishing season. The reason this option was put forward by the allocation working group was due to some of the concerns of reconciling landings data through the following fishing season, and if state-by-state quotas were implemented, the need to try to reconcile that into the current year. It's important to note that among the Commission's FMPs right now, this would be a first in terms of having the ability to transfer quota after the ending of the fishing year, while also specifying a new cutoff date. We have, for a number of FMPs, the ability to have transfers take place after the fishing year ends, but without any sunset clause or any cutoff date. For sea bass and for scup, it's specified that transfers can happen up to 45 days after the fishing season ends. This would obviously be longer than that. So with that, I will take any questions the board has on the options or issue items in the document. Thank you.
Thanks, Kirby. Questions for Kirby? Rob O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Kirby. And I guess I'm just wondering, Addendum 4 is a reference for us. were most of the data problems that states had, and if I recall, there were 3 states perhaps that had the same data for Addendum 4 that moved over to Addendum 5, but a number of states had different data. Were most of the data situations that were problematic involved in the later years after 2010, or was there also some data inconsistencies from the 1998 through 2010 period?
Yeah, thanks, Rob, for your question. I can't remember the specifics for all the states that provided revised data. I do know that some of them did revise their historical data prior to, say, the last 5 years, but it varied across the coast. Some states needed to use averaging for the earlier part of their time series because they don't have great confidence in individual years' landings data, but it really varied state to state.
Additional questions? Bob Ballou.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kirby, I'm trying to read through the document and make sure the document is clear enough on what the 2 options represent regarding the Maine glass eel quota issue. Option 1 is very clear in that it is the level that's been in place since 2015, and if I'm not mistaken, it's based on 2014 landings. That's 9,688. The option 2, 11,479, the document says that this quota level was specified for 2014 and was a 35% reduction from 2012. I'm not sure really what that means, and I'm concerned the public won't have a good sense as to what that option 2 is about. For example, what does it mean to say specified for 2014? Can you add some more clarity as to what that option is intended to represent?
Yeah, thank you, Bob. I will take a stab at it, and I might turn to Maine to provide a little bit more clarity, but they had a quota that they specified for the 2014 fishing season that was a reduction from their 2012 landings level. And I believe part of that was due to some of the requests by the addenda at the time, addenda 3 and 4, to reduce fishing mortality across eels on all life stages. And so it was a 35% reduction in landings level from 2012 in terms of what the 2014 quota was. So the 2015 through 2017 quota level was further reduced from that 2014 quota.
Pat, did you want to add anything to that?
Sure. The only thing I think I would add is Kirby's referenced several times about this 35% reduction. 2012 was when we hit the all-time high landings of 21,000 pounds. There was tremendous concern around this table in regards to the future of this fishery. It was obviously, I don't need to relive all the problems we had, but there was a Wild West happening out there, and we needed to constrain what was happening. One of the measures we took was a voluntary 35% reduction. But we did that. It took 2 years to get to it. So we did that from the 18,000 pound harvest, which dropped us to that 11,000 pound number. So there was that year that we had, the first year we had the 11,000 pound quota. We had harsh winter, a lot of icing, big freshet problems, spring freshet problems. We didn't achieve that quota. We didn't reach that quota. We caught 9,000 pounds. We were in the process of the addendum, and then the board said, well, you didn't catch it, so we'll freeze you at that level. So it probably could have been clearer in the document, but I probably read it. I've lived it so much that I've read it so much that I wasn't thinking about it from a public perception, but I do take your point.
Additional questions for Kirby? Seeing none, we'll now transition to Kristen's report from the Stock Assessment Subcommittee. Kristen?
Thank you. So several questions were posed to the SAS by the working group. We met via conference call to go over these questions that were posed. They were of a technical nature, so this went to the SAS rather than the TC. And we received a presentation much like the one you saw today. The SAS has not reviewed the full document, nor has this been sent to the TC. And so before I get into it, I would say one of the first comments from the SAS was that they recommend the TC review the draft addendum before public comment. The first question to the working group was to provide feedback on the accuracy of the following statement. I'll just read the statement. American eels reach maturity at a young age and smaller size in estuarine waters than in freshwater, and the 19-year time series of landings likely represents at least 2 generations of estuarine yellow eels that have been exposed to the yellow eel fishery. Given the American eel's panmictic life history, if the fishery were causing a population decline, that population decline should be evident in all areas of the species range, especially the areas of maximum exploitation. The SAS agreed that this statement was incorrect, that they cited that stocks declining usually decline from the edges inward, and that we don't manage the full range of this species, that we don't actually know what's going on some of the extreme edges of this population south of Florida or north of Maine. Additionally, the assessment tracks trends in the estuarine waters, not in freshwater areas. There's a whole nother population we don't have information on, and that detecting hyperstability can be difficult for data-poor species. So there just isn't enough information to kind of make that determination. It also does not consider how sex ratios and maturity varies along the coast. And we continue to kind of go back to the stock assessment and say that no trend in a lot of these abundance indices does not mean that they're not increasing. It just means that they're not increasing or decreasing. It doesn't mean that it's meaningless information. So we did see a lot of variety along the coast in many abundance indices. This was another place that the SAS chimed in that the TC really could have something to add to this conversation had they had the opportunity to review the document and this statement. And then lastly, when it came to this statement, they did want to restate that the stock is stable, but it's stable at low and depleted levels. The second question that we discussed was, for the new proposed coastwide landings cap above the status quo, what are the implications for the stock if the coastwide cap is set at a different, higher level than its current level? And the SAS responded with that none of these proposed options, the 12% reduction from the time series average that was suggested the last time they reviewed this for Addendum 4. At that time, the SAS and the TC did meet, and they recommended a decrease of mortality at all life stages, and they suggested a 12% reduction from the 98 to 2010 baseline average, and that number is in parentheses. They thought that was precautionary, and I'll go into a second why that number was chosen. And then at that time, the board still chose the time series average. Again, this stock is data poor, and we have a depleted status, but we don't have reference points, we don't have a model, we have a bunch of abundance indices, we have time series, so we can't do projections, we don't have something to measure this against, but that the current level of harvest may not allow for rebuilding. This is not a table that the SAS reviewed. This is something that I made for your reference for that 12% reduction. This is coming from the 2014, and some of this table was in the TC response to the last addendum. The 12% reduction represented the CVs from the 1998 to 2010 harvest. At that time, the TC and SAS recommended a 12% decrease because it would provide a measurable harvest reduction. So I calculated that up here for you. This is the baseline harvest for 1998 to 2010, which is what it was last time at Addendum 4. And you have your cap in the first column and what the harvest should be with a 12% reduction. I revised that same value for the new landings, since the landings have been updated, to be a higher value. So with the 12% reduction, the Addendum 4 cap would be around 806,000 pounds. If you take the different time series that is suggested by this proposed addendum, that would still be 836,000 pounds. So that's just for your reference what the 12% reduction is. And again, the TC didn't, or the SAS didn't review this, but it is consistent with their advice last time. Question 3, in considering changes to the current management triggers, what is the impact of the resource if the current coastwide cap is exceeded by 2 current management triggers? And those are listed there. And the SAS responded that the assessment is just not quantitative enough to answer this question, but that given the depleted status, increasing harvest will hamper rebuilding possibilities. That stock status is unchanged. This remains a low depleted stock, and also the SAS is now unclear about the board's management goals. It would be easier to respond to some of this if it was clear whether we are trying to keep the stock at the current depleted status at current levels, or if we would like to rebuild, and what we're willing to take, how risky we're willing to be around those estimates. And finally, what type of guidance can the SAS and TC provide the board in addressing overages in the coastwide cap? The SAS felt that this was an allocation issue, not a biological or population issue, and that it depended on your rebuilding targets, or if you intend to rebuild the stock. So we couldn't fully answer that question. And finally, we did discuss the aquaculture plan, and while it does not increase harvest of glass eels along the coast, the quota remains the same as 200 from each state. It does increase access to this quota, that a state that previously didn't have the ability to have aquaculture can now still use their quota. So potentially glass eel harvest is going up. Doing this without requiring any extra data was discouraging to the SAS. You know, we're bringing the quota up for an aquaculture facility up to 600, which falls under the 750 pounds that would require life survey. Understanding that's very difficult to implement, we still may be increasing catch without any additional data coming out of it that will help us better answer these questions in the future if they come back to the SAS or the TC. With the depleted status, harvesting more eels at any stage will not improve the stock and may be detrimental. With that, I will take any questions.
Thank you, Kristen, for your report. Any other questions for Kristen?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for that report, Kristen. The statement, the first response you gave to the statement about the life history, while I was responsible for putting that in the addendum in the first place, and I had some questions about the response, but which I won't go into all of them here, but one that kind of surprised me was that the SAS reiterated this idea that the eel stock is declining from the edge. This, of course, goes back years and years to before we even had the eel plan, with the problems that we're seeing up in Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence. And it's, I know, been a huge argument even up in Canada because, of course, while there were those huge declines in Lake Ontario, in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, eel stocks are in excellent shape. In fact, I just saw this recent magazine article where Dr. Cairns, Dave Cairns, who is probably the top eel expert anywhere of American eels, has said that the, let's see, it was, he says that the stock in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, that the stock is 3 times what they were 20 years ago. So based on that, and back when the assessment was first done in about 2004 and this idea was brought up, I thought that idea had kind of been put by the wayside just because of the unique life history of eels. And that is one of the reasons I brought that up in that point, is that the life history is such as what mechanism would there be for a the life history of the eel with the leptocephali drifting on the Gulf Stream to have an extinction occurring from the edges and not throughout the range. Thanks.
I think that could certainly be worth a discussion that the SAS has, as well as the TC, and that is the first point where they wondered why this hadn't gone to a broader crowd or been able to review the document in its entirety.
Additional questions for Kristen? Rob.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Kristen. And I watched your math exercise there. I'm a little surprised because for some reason, starting back in 2013, I thought the TC was recommending a 10% reduction, but I guess not, and that 12% is the CV of the 1998 through 2010 data. But what's the CV of the 1998 through 2016 data? And it probably is pretty close, but at the same time, I'm wondering, you mentioned the precautionary element that we all talked about back then. And does the fact that the landings from 2011 to 16 still within the range of the cap and everything else? And the idea that when you went through the assessment process, you know, more or less there were some trends down, indices down, some up. Everything's still in a situation where it's depleted stock, but clearly, does the precautionary element change at all in your mind? Thank you.
I'm sorry, I should have been more clear with that table. I did recalculate the CVs, and they're still 12%, even with the updated landings for all three of those boxes. 12% is the CV. Again, we did not debate that specific table. We merely discussed how the stock assessment update did not indicate there's been a big shift since the benchmark. That status is the same, and therefore advice from the SAS was pretty much the same as well. I think that would require a full TC conversation if on the precautionary side, but the SAS did say that their recommendations are similar to the addendum 4, so that would have been the 12%.
We have a question from Dan McKiernan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In one of the previous slides, there was a statement that the 600-pound combined allocations of glass eels would not increase the overall allocation. And does that assume that every state has a 200-pound allocation?
I think every state has the ability to harvest 200 pounds for aquaculture purposes, and so that hasn't changed. Even under the new proposal, every state still has 200 pounds to deal with, whether they allocate it to one facility or two facilities. It's 200 pounds. The argument from the SAS was we're potentially increasing harvest because maybe more people can access that quota now.
If I could respond, in Massachusetts, we have a $10,000 fine established by statute for taking glass eels. So it's really not possible for my state, unless legislation were to be passed, to take part in that 200-pound allocation. And I suspect New Hampshire's in the same boat. They have very severe penalties. So if the third state, you know, was then asking for 600 pounds, that definitely is an increase of the overall allocation. So from a state-to-state basis, some of our states are simply out of this game completely of glass eels by statute.
Additional questions for Kristen. Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Kristen, for all of your work on this. I just wanted to state that I think the intention of that question that was asking about the impacts of exceeding the cap over 2 years really had to do with what is the magnitude of change in harvest that's going to impact this population. And I am very cognizant that we don't have the answers to those questions right now because the species is data poor. But when we're looking at the difference between the recommended cap years ago of 700-something thousand pounds and the current cap of 907, I wonder if that difference of less than 200,000 pounds is really the difference between depleting further, maintaining biomass, or rebuilding. And so I would challenge going forward us to find the data. I would challenge the TC to maybe look at alternative methods. And as this board starts to consider management goals, what is our goal? Is it to maintain stable biomass? Is it to rebuild? The rebuilding question is a puzzle to me because when I look at the indices in the stock assessment, the 30-year and the 40-year, there's not that much of a change over those decades, and the increase is really right back there at the very beginning of the time series. So you can't really know whether that's if that was a, the tail of a downhill, or if it's just a spike. And so it's hard for me, looking at the numbers, to understand what exactly we would be rebuilding to. So I think some advice from the TC on what would we consider if we're looking at rebuilding, how would we do that math? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, we struggle with a lot of these questions because we just don't have the data or the model to answer them in a quantitative way. And so, data needs certainly go into that, and I know we've brought that up before, addressing some of those research recommendations and tagging on more data requests when we increase the cap. I will say another comment that came up on the SAS is that it hasn't been long since we put in Addendum 4, and so we haven't been given it much opportunity to see what we've done differently as far as the stock is concerned from now till then. We only have, 1 or 2 years of data since then, so we don't know how it's even reacted in its entirety to these changes since they haven't been in place for very long. We haven't let the aquaculture be proven or disproven as successful, or the cap, really.
Any additional questions for Kristen? All right, seeing none, our next step would be board discussion of draft Addendum 5. Before we do that, I know there's some folks from the Maine Elvers Association that traveled down here, and I think this would be an appropriate time to allow them a minute or two at the table. And I believe Jeff Pierce, are you here? If you could take the microphone.
Good afternoon, Chairman Gary, members of the American Eel Board. My name is Jeffrey Pierce. I'm here on behalf of the Maine Elver Fishermen's Association. Thank you for allowing me to make comment on Addendum 5. I'm here to urge the board to support an 11,749-pound glass eel quota in the as an option in this upcoming addendum. Raising the quota to 11,749 pounds is justifiable as we look at the history of this fishery. The elimination of harvest and pigmented eels. The state of Maine has a small yellow eel quota, yellow eel fishery. The state of Maine no longer allows the harvesting of silver eels, which we haven't for years. Maine also has addressed poaching in a very successful manner. Maine has successfully implemented swipe cards, which now track every elver from stream to exporter. The state of Maine's management of this glass eel fishery is what success looks like. It would still be a reduction from the 2012-2013 seasons, where there were recorded landings of 18,000 and 20,000 pounds. We at MEFA hope that the quota for Maine's elver fishery would be restored to the 2014 quota. Addendums always have provisions to reduce quota, but rarely provisions to increase quota when things improve, such as the great work that's been done in Maine to improve and open up over 20,000 acres of habitat through dam removal and fish passage projects. We would also ask that this board consider the aquaculture option, as these are new and emerging markets. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jeff. Our next step is board discussion of draft Addendum 5 for public comment. And before we do that, I'll just remind the board that at the October meeting, the board voted unanimously to move this addendum forward, develop it, create the working group, get their input, and as Kirby described it today. So now our challenge is to describe this, and what we're going to need from the board today is focus on what you want to see in that plan as it goes forward, assuming that we do approve it today. What do you want deleted, added, or modified? We'll need motions for all of those unless the modifications are not substantive. So with that, we'll go ahead and start our discussion of draft Addendum 5. Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Either we have a third option for the Maine glass eel quota, or we have some transposed numbers. I think the numbers in the draft the number in the draft addendum for option 2 is 11,479. We have a letter, and we just heard somebody, Mr. Pierce, advocating for 11,749. So I'm going to assume that the draft document is accurate and that there's been a transposition of numbers by the advocates. I just want to make sure that's the case and we're not talking about a third option here. So my first point is just to clarify that the number in the document is the accurate number.
To the best of my understanding right now, Bob, but we can double check that.
I'm sorry. I was just looking at some notes that I made and doing some quick math on our reductions, and I came up with 11,749 as well when I did it. So we may have two numbers switched, but.
I could follow, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Bob.
So thank you for that clarification. I think it'll be important to get that number correct. And then I think, just to follow up on my earlier point, I think it would behoove the public to just provide a little bit more in the way of background in terms of how the Maine elver fishery has evolved. The fishery as it intersected with management, because it sounds to me, and Pat, thank you for that answer earlier, that there were some self-imposed quotas that Maine instituted, if I'm not mistaken, and it's not really clear from the document that that's what happened, and which was then followed by board action that codified the quota at a lesser amount. So it just, to help the public in trying to understand what this option is about, I would suggest, so this is just a qualitative suggestion, I don't have any specific language, it's just to perhaps put a little bit more in this document that walks the public through the evolution of the Maine glass eel fishery to help them better understand how these two options relate. Thank you.
Additional comments, hopefully focused on changes that you'd like to see. John.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Under 3.3, issue 1, the coastwide cap, the comment that the SASC actually evaluated in their statement, as I mentioned, I do want to discuss it further, but being that it is controversial, I would think it would be a good idea to just take that whole statement out of the addendum, the one that American eels reach maturity at a younger age, that whole point that was found incorrect by the SASC. Like I said, I want to discuss it further, but don't think it needs to be in the addendum.
So to remove that language that, John, you mentioned, we need a motion to strike that language. Do we have someone that would make a motion to that effect? Sheree?
Can't hear me yet? I'd like to move to strike the following language from the draft addendum 5 based on the Stock Assessment Subcommittee's questioning of the statement. Given the American eel's panmitic life history, if the fishery were causing a population decline, that population decline should be evident in all areas of its range, especially the areas of maximum exploitation.
Do we have a second to the motion? Lynn. And any discussion? Is there any opposition to this motion? Seeing none, motion passes. Okay, moving on. Lynn Fagley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just wondering, to Dan's point about the pooling of harvest, where some states, the harvest of glass eels is absolutely prohibited, and so you would have states with no glass eel harvest essentially ceding their 200-pound allocation to a neighboring state. So I think it might be good for the public to understand a little bit about that, if there could be a little bit of language added. Thank you.
All right, additional comments. Rob O'Reilly.
Is this open season on everything there?
It is.
Okay. I guess when Kirby went over the options, that there's really not anything in place for how it would be moving forward. I don't remember the exact numbers, whether it was 5A, 5B, the 1%, all of that, but there's nothing in place really to decide how things move forward. It might be better to say, whoever it's going to be, the technical committee, perhaps the working group, that just some assurance to the public that it's not as if it's not going to be taken care of. That's one comment. The second comment, I'd like to comment on the transfers. I think we've heard throughout, whether it's transfer, allocation, whatever the situation is, that there have been data problems. There's no doubt about it. However, it does seem that those data problems have been reconciled, and Kirby gave everyone enough time to do that, and states that didn't already have the same data travel from Addendum 4 to Addendum 5 did provide more information. So we can't now say that the data that are there through 2016 are inconsistent. What we can say as far as transfers is that there still can be situations, especially with the late fall fishery, that it may make it difficult to have a calendar year transfer. For that reason, when the working group met, I did suggest April 1. The reason I suggested April 1 is I know by April 1, all the data we have offshore and inshore, that's it. That's the cutoff for us. But it doesn't have to be April 1. I recognize that Kirby put up scup and black sea bass, which have 45 days and carry over to February 15th. That probably would work in my opinion as well. At least it gives that extra time for the state that wishes to transfer to realize that the data are pretty sound, rather than doing projections at some point earlier in the same calendar year of a transfer where they're unsure. So I would think, probably to be consistent, that I would move that we establish the transfer period for 45 days following the previous calendar year. And I think that was February 15th, if I'm not mistaken. So I would like to make that motion.
Okay, we'll try to get that up on the screen.
Yeah, give us a second, Rob, to get it up on the screen for you.
While we're waiting for that to go up, can I queue up a couple of other folks that are interested, again, looking at changes, additions, deletions, modifications? Anyone? All right, we'll wait. Second first.
Yeah, we need a second.
There's a second to the motion. Kathy Davenport. So the motion is to move to establish a transfer cutoff date of no more than 45 days.
Can't be the same statement.
We can't have a second from the same state, Kathy and Robert from Virginia, so I'm looking for that second again.
Gotcha.
Michelle Duval. All right, now we can read it in. Move to establish a transfer cutoff date of no more than 45 days after the fishing season ends, February 15th. Motion by Mr. O'Reilly, seconded by Dr. Duval. Discussion? Cherie.
One of the main points that the work group came up with is that there still could not be data that has been received by some states by this deadline, and that data quality are assessed at the time that the data are available to ACCSP, which is at that April deadline. It's actually a little bit before the ACCSP deadline. So this would ensure that any data that are assessed are correct for transfers or for quota. Thank you.
Additional discussion? Rob?
Cherie's correct. We had that discussion. I think what ACCSP told us that by May 1, they would have more or less final data. There's always some amount of delinquent. And I just don't think we can get it any later than what's up there. That's why I made the motion. I think it gives a little bit of tolerance. Generally, when you make transfers, you're doing some type of projection, and you're usually being conservative anyway. When you transfer quota, you're making sure that you don't implicate yourself in a problem of an overage. So although I recognize what ACCSP said, I think that probably this is as close as we're going to be able to come to having tolerance that's necessary, you know, given the way the fishery is prosecuted, especially in the late fall. Thank you.
Additional discussion? Is there any opposition to the motion? And seeing none, motion passes. All right, we're moving on. Any other items that Management Board sees? Cherie Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to move to delete option 3 of issue 1, where their discussion of reduction of minimum landings to 5 states. Amendment 4 provided a minimum of 2,000 pounds for these states that have had low landings, and to take those landings and reduce them even more continues to prevent fisheries that had been there or that may be developing in the future. And just keep in mind that if there are no fisheries in these 5 states, that the quota can be transferred to other states. Thank you.
Cherie, can you clarify which option we're referring to in the document?
Option 3. I'm sorry, issue 1, option 3. It's the allocation. Issue 3, sorry.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get that up on the board. Do we have a second to that motion? Craig Minor. All right, discussion. Lynn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would oppose this motion. This is allocation. It's an extremely difficult topic, and I fully understand the sentiment of cutting that base allocation for the low harvest states to leave room, that there wouldn't be as much room for them to develop fisheries. But on the other hand, that base allocation, the higher you make it, the bigger the cost to fishermen who are earning livings now. So it's allocation. It's very difficult. I think for full disclosure, in the work group with the inception of option 3, the idea was to maintain that spirit of the addendum 4 allocation, but to redistribute the quota more equitably. And initially the thought was to leave these low harvest states leave them alone and not bind them to a quota because they have such little impact on the harvest as a whole. Essentially, it's taking a little bit of a play out of the Menhaden book, but none of us really had the stomach to do that for another species. So the idea was to give low harvest states quota that they would have ownership of, and I can see the point that it's less, but I also think that there are other options that are extremely create great problems. There's options that give certain states a quota of 2 pounds. There's options that reduce the state of Maryland by over 30%. So I think given that broad range, at the end of the day, with allocation, that's what we do. We create winners and losers, and I think we owe it to the public to take all of the options out for comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Would anybody else like to speak to this motion? Dan?
I just have a question. Did the working group consider a system analogous to what we have in black sea bass and scup, where underages are redistributed to states with overages based on the proportional shares that the states with overages have?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Dan. So my recollection was, while there might have been some discussion, I don't believe that the allocation working group flushed out an option to mirror what we have in place for black sea bass and scup for the eel fishery, the yellow eel fishery, sorry.
If I could follow up, well, the advantage to that is states that aren't using their quota, it would automatically get placed back into the mix and available to those states with overages. And I think it's certainly better than a system where we start getting phone calls, late in the season. And as much as it's rewarding to be able to give your friends some fish when they need it, it seems like it's a system that ASMFC could do without in terms of the first state that makes the call gets the fish. So I don't know if there's a way to get that into the addendum or not.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So as Marty laid out, if that's an option you want to see in the document, this would be the time now to add that in, to make a motion to add that in. I will point out that when the allocation working group did discuss this as staff, I did bring up that the black sea bass transfer system is not a perfect one, and that we spend much of the later part of the fall into the winter trying to reconcile some of those landings. And for summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, we have some of the best reporting in place, and we know that the eel fishery is not quite on the same level. So as staff, I did express some concern that trying to mirror it might not be quite the same.
So we still have the motion on the table, and Dan, we may come back if you want to make that motion. We have further discussion on this motion. Michelle?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to agree with my colleague from Maryland regarding, I think we really owe it to the public to take all of the options with regard to allocation out for public comment. We spent a long time on all of these, and as Lynn has stated, this is a difficult issue, and I think it bears noticing that there are some other options in there that would have, that would provide those states even less than the 2,000 pound allocation that is available under the current addendum for quotas. So I think the working group did a really good job of paring things down to a reasonable range of alternatives, to use some Magnuson Act language, but I am not going to support this motion. Thank you.
Okay. Any additional comments? Ready for a vote then. So is there a need to caucus? We're ready for the vote? All of those in favor of this motion, raise your hand. All those opposed? I'm opposed, yes, thank you. Abstentions? No votes? The motion fails 4-11-2. All right, we'll move on. Additions, deletions, modifications. Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kirby, and I apologize, I should have asked Kirby this question earlier. Did the rec working group consider lowering the coastwide cap, namely to a level that I think I heard Kristen refer to, which would be consistent with the technical committee's recommendation as adjusted based on the updated landings? And the number I think I got from her presentation was 836,969. Did the rec working group make a in their recommendation, was there any discussion to returning to that recommended technical committee level for the coastwide cap?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Bob. So my recollection was that the allocation working group did not discuss a coastwide cap below the current status quo level.
So my follow, Mr. Chair, is I'm wondering if this is a disservice to the public to not offer, although I realize it may not be warmly received by a number of board members, if I'm not mistaken, we are still right now essentially under a recommendation to lower the coastwide cap, and Kristen was kind enough to offer that adjusted number of 836,969. I'm going to put that in the form of a motion, that should be added as an option to the document and explained in the way that essentially it should be explained, consistent with the recommendations that this board received from the technical committee several years ago, which, as I understand, remain relevant. So I'd like to move to add that option to the addendum for consideration, and I hope staff captured that. If not, I'll try to further clarify.
Thank you, Bob. So just wanted to be clear, your motion is to set an option for the coastwide cap that is a 12% reduction from the baseline harvest of 1998 to 2016, which would be 836,969 pounds.
I couldn't have said it any better.
So there's a motion. Do we have a second? Richie White. Discussion on the motion. There's no discussion on this motion. Michelle Duval.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, I mean, certainly, yeah, that's a reasonable option. It is, consistent with technical advice received in the past. I certainly don't have a problem including it to take out to the public, but I suspect that it may not necessarily be an option that the board is willing to entertain as a final option down the road when we get there. Thank you.
Any other discussion by the board? Is there any opposition to this motion? All right, let's have a vote then. All those in favor of this motion, raise their hands. All those opposed, raise their hands. 2. Abstentions? 0. Motion passes 15-2-0. On with further discussion on draft addendum 5. Colleen?
Hi, I'm hoping that maybe somebody who was on the working group can just help me explain the rationale for the approach on page 19. Under option 3, the last paragraph, where 0.75% of the coastwide cap was set aside, divided, and then reduced.
Yeah, I can take, so one of the things that the idea here was, if you envision, if you look at the table that shows how the quotas compare to the last 5 years of harvest. So if you take the Addendum 4 quotas and you compare them to the last 5 years of harvest, there were 3 states that took a reduction. And the intent of this was to mitigate those reductions by those 3 states. So basically, all that did with that division, we took the 0.75%, set it aside, divided it among the small harvest states, and then just rounded down, and then just allocated that extra, which was a couple, it wasn't maybe not even, I can't remember the number, but it was maybe 1,000 pounds back to the state of Maryland to help mitigate their reduction. That's all it was.
Colleen, did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Michelle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess maybe just a quick circling back to the pooling of the 200-pound potential aquaculture allocation, and the point that Dan was making earlier about, for Massachusetts, it would require statutory change in order to allow for any glass seal harvest, if I'm understanding that correctly, without, this $10,000 fine. And so it seems to me that it might not be possible, based on that statutory language, for a 200-pound aquaculture allocation that Massachusetts itself is unable to apply for could be allowed to be used in this pooling fashion. I mean, I understand we have the language in there with regard to making an argument for allowing for all of that pooled harvest to potentially be used in one watershed or in one state. I guess maybe the question that I'm trying to get to is, so a state that has that type of statutory restriction could not be forced into entering into one of these pooling agreements. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was my concern. I guess when I think of the 200-pound allowance among all states, I never really thought of that as a cumulative allocation of glass eels, because if it was, I wouldn't think twice about sending eels up to Maine. But we don't look at that as a foregone allocation, because our state has a prohibition, as does New Hampshire's. So I'm not comfortable with this notion that that's foregone allocation.
Question to any of the other board members. Do any of the other states have a similar potential statutory impediment as Massachusetts is describing, as Michelle brought up, that you're aware of? Craig, can you talk to it?
Under our current law, we have a statutory prohibition against the taking of glass eels. But I'm not aware that we have any fines such as laid out in Massachusetts.
And John.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, that was part of Addendum 3, right, is that we had to have a 9-inch minimum. So all states other than Maine and South Carolina, I think, effectively have a prohibition on taking glass eels. But the point of this is that if states decide they want to do this for aquaculture, which is allowed by Addendum 4, they could still do that under Addendum 5, except states could pool those 200 pounds that Addendum 4 says they can apply for.
Shuri?
Yeah, the state of New Hampshire also has that limitation for harvest beyond 9 inches, or under 9 inches.
Pack here.
I believe all the states have a 9-inch minimum. So, as John said, it's a de facto, with the exception of the original management plan said that only the states that had a glass eel fishery at the time could do, and I know this is a little bit different because this is aquaculture, and I think what we're trying to do is avoid having what we had to do for the North Carolina plan, having countless meetings where we're discussing this, and so make it more general, but I'm not sure if that's going to work, having 3 states do this as a consolidation.
And Ross, was that just an acknowledgement, or did you want to?
No, just my recollection of that discussion was that that there would be that potential for a 200-pound aquaculture allocation for each state, but the pooling of those allocations was not, in my recollection of the discussion, was not shipping 200 pounds of glass eels from New Hampshire somewhere. It was allowing a state that needed to accumulate some aquaculture allocation to borrow those allocations from other states, and all those glass eels would come from in that jurisdiction, hence the concern about the 750-pound trigger.
Michelle?
So that, a state that had a prohibition, there would still be the option for them to let somebody have their allocation because they couldn't use it. That was my understanding of what we discussed.
Thank you, Ross. We have Michelle and then Pat Keller.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to follow up, obviously everyone's got the 9-inch minimum size limit in there. For us, for North Carolina, our commission had to provide a declaratory ruling in order to allow an aquaculture facility to actually, harvest and possess eels that are under that limit. But I think there's a difference between something that is in rule versus statute, and I think that was really, what I was getting at is, are there statutory impediments that would prevent that pooling? And it, based on what Ross and others have said, it doesn't sound like that's necessarily an impediment. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly understand the point that Dan and others have made about their statutes, but if the state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts wanted to move forward with the development of an aquaculture facility and there was an economic benefit and a driver to push in that direction, the state would have that flexibility to change that law or change that rule. And I think that's really the intent of this. It's not to be restrictive, it's to say here is an opportunity for a state, if it wanted to work with another state, to be able to pool their resources. If it doesn't work for a state, they don't have to. If it does, then there's a benefit here for them to change their rules if there is, again, that economic benefit back to that state through partnerships or whatever the issue may be. I think there is very real interest in this country to see the development of aquaculture. It would be great to see the value-added side of this leave those Asian countries and be done here in the United States, and to try to find a way to help enable that to happen was the intent of this edition.
Any additional comments on this concept? I wonder if I look to staff to, I was trying to sort through that to see whether or not this causes any issues for this narrative to remain in the document based on what we've heard.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think Michelle pointed out kind of well what we're trying to clarify here, and if states have statutory language that would provide impediments to this versus if they have rules in place right now on prohibition of harvesting glass eels, eels below 9 inches. So it would be helpful for developing this document further if the board, if the will of the board is to have this option in here to clarify how moving forward states who currently have language in their either statutes or regulations may seek to change those to allow for this option to move forward, or how it would work for those states who can't make those changes or are planning not to.
Dan?
I'll be quick. Yeah, Pat's right. his perspective is correct here. I guess I feel a little frustrated because the North Carolina experiment, to my knowledge, has failed in terms of production. And if somebody came forward and said, you know, I've hit the wall here on 200 pounds, is there any way we could grab 200 pounds from adjacent states and make a viable operation? I'd feel a little more sympathetic. But right now, I think we're jumping the gun.
Any further discussion? I guess the question again is, you know, there's a concern on the board to the point where we might consider modification or removal of this component. Is there any desire on the board to do so? Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to speak on behalf of leaving it in there. I don't know what the synergy is. I don't know what the magic number is in terms of an appropriate aquaculture model, but let's say it is some number beyond 200 pounds. If there are 3 states that have statutory prohibitions to developing this kind of a fishery, yet from a scientific perspective and from a business perspective, putting 3 states' allocation together somewhere makes sense, then I think going out to the public now with it in there would allow us a pathway in the future. If we don't have it in there, then we're kind of trying to create something after we've just gone out to the public. So I would request that it stay in.
Is there any advocacy for removing this narrative or modifying it in some way? If not, then we'll go see if we can find a way to keep this intact. And I think, Kirby, what you were suggesting is some additional clarification based on some of those concerns that we can build in to address this. And if that meets the board's satisfaction, we'll move on with any additional ideas, concerns, additions, deletions. David.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I'm certainly not an advocate of, I guess, reallocating things on a whim, I know that we have some options that we have to keep. One of them is status quo as far as, allocation or triggers. But if we do go to an allocation scheme, some of these numbers are pretty scary on the first pass, and then I understand the more weighted approach and the 0.75% helps to minimize such an acute impact, but I don't know what would be the appropriate language to add. While this might not be the biggest fishery on the East Coast, it's probably a very huge fishery to certain folks. Maybe there might be some, some interest on the board to possibly find a way to, if we do get to this path, if this is what we have chosen, a way to phase it in rather than, well, year 1, year 2, boom, next year, you guys get 108, you guys take a 62% loss, we'll see you next week. Some way to sort of ease that transition. I would hate to see any state have to take even a 20% cut. We've done it repeatedly, but anyway, any help I could get possibly, if there's any interest in doing that, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Any other thoughts, comments about the draft Addendum 5? So one question Kirby and I are discussing is there was some concern around the table about having the SAS review the document one more time before we put it out to the public. The technical committee. Is that desirous of this board, or is this board comfortable with approving the agenda with the modifications we've moved forward today? Anybody like to comment on that? Pat Kelleher.
I think those two things can actually happen in parallel. I'd like to see the document move out to the public and then have the TC review the modified document, and then that can be part of the overall discussion when we come back.
Thank you, Pat. Richie?
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I was just questioning timing. What that would, if we were going to send it back to the technical committee, then what would the timing be?
Yeah, thank you, Richie, for the question. So the next board meeting we would have scheduled right now is in May. So unless the board wanted to moved to try to have a conference call to review the document again prior to public comment period starting. The plan moving forward would be to modify the document today based on the board's feedback and start public comment period without an additional review by the board. So it's at the pleasure of the board on how you want to proceed.
Well, thank you. How would that then proceed, timing for a finished product?
I think if the board was interested in seeing a modified version of the document before it went out for public comment, that would change the timetable. We may still be able to get it out for public comment and review and public comment period to happen before the May meeting, assuming that there was a quick modification to the document and a short period for the board to have an additional time to look at it. The question then becomes if there is an interest in having a conference call of the board to clarify and specify that all board members are fine with it, or if it would simply be an email review and sign off.
Pat?
I was going to quickly try to find it. I haven't, so I'm going to ask Kirby. Any delay beyond that, where does that leave the state of Maine as far as our quota for this coming year? Unlimited? There's a few Alver fishermen in the back of the room I might have just made happy with that.
So Pat, as you remember, we at the annual meeting specified Maine's glass eel quota for 2018. So this addendum is specific to changes in management starting in the 2019 fishing season.
Lynn?
The technical review wouldn't change the options as they're written, right? It would just change language in the background and in some of the rationales. Is that correct? But the options themselves wouldn't change.
You know, it would be kind of how the board chose to specify the technical committee's review of the document. So part of the reason why, as staff, we had the SAS review the document in terms of the questions that were posed was due to some of the very specific nature of that, to the condition of the stock, how things would respond on the stock level to changes in harvest levels. In terms of having the technical committee review the document, it's at the board's discretion how you want to specify that TC tasking. Otherwise, it would just go to the TC as we do with all of our technical documents and have them provide any comments and recommendations during the public comment period.
I have Eric Reed and then Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to make a motion to approve Addendum 5 as modified today for public comment. I don't like the thought of having that. Oh, I'm sorry. If I get a second, maybe I'll give my round.
Second by Emerson Hasbrook.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't like the idea of sending a document out to the public and to the TC at the same time. That makes me really uncomfortable. You know, I'm sure to the delight of everyone, I think we only took out one thing, which was some language, and then we've added a bunch of stuff in here. I don't really see why the TC has to get back into this before we go to the public. That's my motion, and let's get moving.
So we have a motion and a second. We have further discussion on this. Seeing none, need a caucus? I'll give you one minute. Are you ready for a call for the vote? Before we offer that up, just talking to Kirby, for those individuals on the board who made additions, it'd be very helpful for staff if they would commit to take some time to help staff, and I can help moderate that, to work with them to incorporate the language as they intended. So as long as everybody's amenable to that, we'll go forward with the vote. So we have a motion, sorry, I don't have my screen up, to approve draft Addendum 5 for public comment as modified today. Motion by Mr. Reed, seconded by Mr. Hasbrook. All those in favor, please raise your hand. All of those opposed, please raise your hand. Abstentions? The motion passes unanimously. All right, our next item on the agenda is the approval of the 2017 Fishery Management Plan Review and State Compliance Reports, and Kirby will lead this discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll try to go through this quickly as we're a little bit behind schedule, and I'd like to try to get us to end on time if possible. All right, so the outline, I'm just going to go through the status of the F&P, stock status, as you're all familiar with, status of the fishery, state compliance with the F&P, and plan review team recommendations. So as you all are aware, there were no new addenda that were initiated in 2016. Another plan for the American eel aquaculture farm was submitted and approved for the 2017 fishing season. Just so you all are aware, again, for these F&P reviews, we have a one-year lag, so we're talking about how things played out in 2016. Again, the F&P specifies per addendum 4 that any state that harvests over 750 pounds of glass eel a year must implement a fishery independent life cycle survey. Maine implemented this survey starting in 2016. No data was collected in 2016 due to staffing issues, and that has been rectified, and the technical committee anticipates receiving an update on the 2017 survey results later this year. So I will go through this briefly again. The stock status, per the 2017 stock assessment update, the American eel stock status remains depleted as we have no reference points to base management on. There has been no update from that level that was laid out in 2012. It's important to note that in the fall of this year, given the depleted status and interest in addressing some of the management concerns, the board initiated an addendum to consider alternative allocations for the coastwide cap management trigger and state-by-state allocations for the yellow eel and glass eel fisheries. In terms of the status of the fishery on the commercial side, I'm reporting out here what the landings were as was reported through the compliance report. So please note that these numbers do differ from what I went through in Addendum 5, so they are in turn old. State reported landings of yellow and silver eels was 885,000 pounds in 2015 and 937,000 pounds in 2016. It was an increase from 2015 to 2016, and Maryland and Virginia accounted for the bulk of the harvest at about 72%. Landings of glass eels were reported from Maine and South Carolina, and we aggregate those together. In 2015, it was 5,442 pounds, and in 2016, it was 9,339 pounds. Again, South Carolina harvests a very small number. In terms of the recreational fishery, as of 2009, recreational data was no longer provided for American eels in the compliance reports. This is due to the unreliability of intercepting anglers who fish for eels and the associated high PSCs with those estimates. I'm going to go through very quickly the glass eel, yellow eel, and silver eel regulations. Because there were no changes and no noted changes in state regulations, the PRT found no issues there. On the glass eel front, regarding the yellow eel, there was no changes in management measures as reported in the compliance reports. And again, the PRT noted no issues on yellow eel regulations. Regarding the silver eel regulations, the same. There was no changes in regulations, and in turn, the plan review team noted there was no issues. In terms of other management measures, there was no other additional changes in regulations. In terms of considering other management measures and potential issues, the PRT, when they did their review, did note that the District of Columbia, had not submitted a compliance report. We have an update to this. As of yesterday afternoon, we did receive a compliance report from DC, and they continue to not have a commercial fishery, nor commercial landings, nor recreational data. Regarding de minimis, the FMP stipulates that states may apply for de minimis status for each life stage if the preceding 2 years their average commercial landings constitute less than 1% of the coastwide commercial landings for that life stage. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida requested de minimis status for their yellow eel fisheries. All states that applied for de minimis status for yellow eels met the 1% landing criteria. The District of Columbia also met that criteria, but did not specify an interest in continuing de minimis status. South Carolina requested de minimis status for glass eels, but did not meet the 1% landings criteria. So lastly, in terms of plan review team recommendations, the PRT had the following items to bring to the board's attention. First, the state compliance reports noted no issues in terms of regulations or issues with the FMP, but that in terms of considerations, currently the plan lays out that states should provide an estimate of the percent of harvest that goes to food versus bait. It was noted on the plan review team call that this is a challenging estimate, one that isn't very reliable, and that it isn't clear that it's being used for management purposes, and so there should be the consideration of possibly doing away with it. There was also a recommendation that states should continue to work with law enforcement agencies to include information on illegal or undocumented fisheries for eels. The PRT also requested that the state of New York work to separate their yellow and silver eel landings. As you know, Addendum 4 laid out that the allocations did account for eel landings in New York that did have silver eels in them. And then there was also a request by the plan review team that states should try to quantify upstream and downstream passage changes and then provide that information to the technical committee for review, as there has been some changes in both upstream and downstream passages in a number of states. So with that, I'll take any questions on the FMP review or state compliance reports. Thank you.
Barring any questions, do we have a motion to accept the 2017 FMP review and compliance reports and the de minimis requests? Roy Miller?
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
In a second. Jim Gilmore. So the motion is to approve the 2017 FMP review of the 2016 fishing year and approve de minimis requests for New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, the District of Columbia, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida for yellow eel. Motion by Mr. Miller, seconded by Mr. Gilmore. All those in favor, please raise your hand. I should have asked if there was any objections. Any objections? Learning every minute. And the motion passes unanimously. Next up is the advisory panel report, and Kirby will offer that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll again try to be brief on this. So the AP met back in December of 2017. They received an update on the 2017 stock assessment report, recent technical committee work, and an update on recent management board activities. So you all are aware of the stock assessment update report. Jeff Brust of the SAS provided that. There were questions that were posed on whether fishing license data information dating back to the 1970s could be used to ascertain the stock's size in a more historical context. It was pointed out that many states did not actually have license data information on eels until the 1990s. The AP encouraged the stock assessment subcommittee to collaborate with Canada's Division of Fish and Oceans to conduct a range-wide stock assessment. Regarding recent technical committee work, my colleague Kristen Anstead presented on the aging workshop that took place in January of this year, at least the planning that was going into that, recent analysis on the young of year surveys, and nematode research that's been conducted by Zoema. Information on Each of those reports can be found in the advisory panel summary that was included in meeting materials. Then next, regarding recent board activity, as staff, we highlighted the recent board approval of North Carolina's aquaculture proposals and the board's initiation of draft addendum 5. One AP member requested that the addendum consider an option for pooling of glass seal aquaculture harvests among multiple states, and that interest stemmed from the high market price for glass seals. The AP, it was noted, will have an opportunity to comment on the draft addendum 5 during the public comment period, and that AP report will be presented to the board at their next meeting. Lastly, Mary Beth DeLucia, the AP chair, brought up that the IUCN is going through a reassessment of the American eel resource in 2018. The IUCN currently lists American eel on their red list. That designation is used for American eel and a number of species to guide the prioritization of conservation initiatives by governments, NGOs, and scientific institutions. It's also important to note that the IUCN does not have management authority but can influence public perception and international trade. And it was highlighted that any new information that comes out of that will be shared both with the advisory panel and the board once available. So with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Kirby. We'll move on to item 7 on the agenda, the election of a vice chair. Do we have a motion? Sheree Patterson.
Yes, I'd like to move to nominate Lynn Fegley as vice chairperson to the American Eel Management Board.
Do we have a second? John Clark. Is there any objection to this nomination? Lynn, welcome to the American Eel Board. You're the vice chair. All right. Our last item, other business. Before we do that, I did have a question for staff, and perhaps this would trickle over to Sherry with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I recall at the October board meeting a brief update on CITES, and I'm just wondering, is that something that would manifest itself, say, at the next board meeting, or are we looking further down the line on that, Kirby?
So maybe I'll take a first stab, and Sherry can clarify my comments. As staff, we were notified that CITES is going to go through a process in 2018 of evaluating trade of American eel. That means that they're going to look at landings data, not just in terms of what was caught in the U.S., but what was also exported out of the country. And so they will be likely in contact with us again to try to make sense of any discrepancies they find there. In terms of the timetable of when we're expecting that follow-up, it's to be determined. We don't have a set date yet.
That's correct, Kirby. I think that you summed that up just right, and we'll let you know if we do hear any more information on timing on that.
All right. Thank you, Kirby, and thank you, Sherry. Is there any other business to come before this board? Seeing none, we are adjourned, and thank you for your infinite patience.